The card sharp entered Redemption, Montana, on the last Thursday of October, and by sundown every man in the Long Branch Saloon knew his name. He called himself Mr. Hollis, though no one in town could truthfully say where Mr. Hollis had come from. He carried a single dark leather case under his arm and wore a coat the color of a bruise. He was not a tall man. He was not a young man. He moved with the unhurried calm of someone who had already won everything he came to win and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to notice. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love knowing who's with us. 3 hours after Mr. Hollis sat down at the round table in the corner, the company of men who had come to fleece the new stranger had lost, between them, for $160, 2 silver watches, a woman's wedding ring wagered in pride, and a good deal of certainty about their own intelligence. The saloon keeper, a thick-armed man named Edgar with hands that always looked like they had been scrubbing something, watched Mr. Hollis shuffle and felt the cold breath of something he could not name move down the back of his neck. Mr. Hollis played with the same 3 movements every hand. He cut. He squared. He dealt. He never raised. He never bluffed. He never looked away from the cards. And he did not lose. For 11 nights he sat at that table. He played whoever came. The ranchers. The freighters. The bored cavalry lieutenant with the dark circles under his eyes. He took their money the way a man takes water from a stream, without effort, without apology, without hurry. By the 12th night, the stories of him had outgrown the saloon. They said he had killed a man in Cheyenne over a disagreement about a queen of diamonds. They said he could read the backs of cards through his fingertips. They said he had never in his life been on the wrong end of a hand. Behind the Long Branch, in a small rented room that smelled of lamp oil and old wood, lived a woman by the name of Adah Whitlock. She was 71 years old. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall. She had been completely blind for 9 years, and partly blind for almost 20 before that. She made her living by reading palms in the front parlor of a boarding house on Tuesday and Friday afternoons, and on the other days she sat in her room with her hands folded over her knees and listened to the town. She knew the rhythm of redemption the way a mother knows the breathing of her sleeping child. She knew how many carts crossed Maine by the hour. She knew the barks of every dog belonging to every household within 4 blocks. She knew the precise difference between the front door of the church and the front door of the undertaker because the hinges sang in different keys. The boy who brought her meals was named Eli Marsh. He was 17. His mother had died the winter before in a house fire a county over, and he had walked into Redemption with the limp of a healed broken leg, 2 shirts, and a folded letter he kept in his pocket that he had never sent and never would. Adah was the first person in town who had spoken his name to him by the 3rd week without him having to remind her. Eli was, in fact, the second person in the entire state of Montana to whom Adah had ever spoken the words "I see you." The first had been her late husband, Walter, 15 years gone, who had said them to her the morning after they married when she had wept in the courthouse for no reason she could name. Eli brought her supper of stew and bread on the Thursday that Mr. Hollis came to town. He told her about the man who never lost. He told her the way he told her everything, with more detail than his own life required. Counting the cards Mr. Hollis wore on his cuffs, mimicking the unhurried way he lifted a glass, rubbing his thumb against his fingers the way Mr. Hollis did, watching his own hands, until Adah said softly, "Child, your stew is getting cold." He sat across from her and ate with her as he often did. His shoulders were beginning to broaden. There was something in his face that landed between boy and not yet man, and Adah felt it the way she felt most things about the people she loved, not by looking, but by the sound his spoon made against the rim of his bowl when he was trying not to listen, and by the way he breathed when he thought something was unfair. He cleared the dishes that night with the particular care of a boy who had once had nothing. Before he left, he turned at the door and said, the way boys say things they have weighed and measured and decided not to take back, "Adah, that man is not honest. I know cheating the way a man knows a lying voice. I grew up with one. He is cheating, and nobody is going to do anything because nobody wants to know." Adah did not answer with words. She gave him the small nod that meant she had heard him and would think about what he had said. After the door closed, she sat in her chair for a long time, listening to the Long Branch in the distance, separating the laughter of men who had money from the laughter of men who did not. She knew the difference between them the way she knew the difference between afternoon and dusk. One carried a kind of fullness in it. The other carried the breathlessness of pretending. She began to think about cards. She had not touched a deck of playing cards in 11 years. Walter had been the one who had loved them. He had taught her to read the bumps and bevels of them when her eyes first began to fail. Each card, in the factory, has a tiny texture on its face. Hearts are smooth. Diamonds have a faint grain. Clubs are coarse. Spades vary, suit by suit, king by king. Walter had walked her through the whole deck one summer night in their kitchen with the lamp ticking between them. He had made her laugh by getting the Queen of Hearts wrong on purpose. He had made her cry by telling her that the world had given her the wrong eyes for this life, but the right hands. Now, in the quiet room, Adah Whitlock sat and remembered the texture of each card in order. She listened to the wind move down the alley. She thought of Eli. She thought of the men in the Long Branch losing money they could not afford, and of the boys who worked the stables whose wages were already owed, and of the widow Granger across the way whose only son had been 3 days into a losing streak that would not end. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. She went to the small chest at the foot of her bed and took out the deck of cards Walter had left her in his will, along with the land that had already been sold by the lawyer who handled his estate, and the kitchen clock that no longer worked, and the gold locket she had not worn in 9 years. She would go down to the Long Branch at 8 o'clock the next evening. She would take Walter's deck. She would sit across from Mr. Hollis and ask him, in the calm voice her husband had loved most, if he would do her the honor of one quiet hand of poker between an old woman and a gentleman. The next evening, when she walked through the swinging doors of the Long Branch with Eli 2 steps behind her, the room went quiet the way a prairie goes quiet before weather. She was led to the corner table by the bartender, who placed the chair for her himself. Mr. Hollis was already there. He had been told a blind woman had requested a game. He was smiling. Adah sat. She set Walter's deck between them and said, before anything else, I have come a long way to sit in this chair tonight. Eli tells me you are the man who cannot lose. I have not come to prove him right. I have come to see for myself what a man who cannot lose does when he is asked to play fair. The room settled into a listening breath. Mr. Hollis, still smiling, said, and his voice was the polite kind that meant almost nothing, "Ma'am, I would be honored." He did not say fair. He did not say the word at all. He only nodded toward the deck and waited. Adah asked the bartender to shuffle with both hands. She asked Mr. Hollis to cut. Then she ran her own fingers across the stacked cards before her, slowly, with the unhurried grace of a woman praying, and dealt them face down, alternating, 2 at a time. She did this without hesitation. She did this the way you or I might tie a familiar knot. What would you have done in her place? Would you have sat down across from a man who had broken 12 nights of men's pride, knowing that if you were wrong, every eye in the room would be on you from a place of pity? Mr. Hollis watched her hands. He watched the faintest movement of her shoulder as she touched each card, listening, he thought, for raised edges. He had played against a blind woman one other time, 20 years ago, in Abilene. That woman had been fooled by the subtle differences in ink thickness. He had won everything from her in 20 minutes. He had never thought of her again until now, and now he only half thought of her, the way one thinks of a dog from childhood. He began to deal. He used his practiced 3 movements. He cut. He squared. He dealt. Each card left his thumb with the same tilt, the same pressure. His hands were very beautiful hands. Men in the room watched them. Adah did not. She listened. She listened the way she had listened her whole life. Not for what people said, but for what they could not help saying while they believed themselves to be silent. She turned her cards. She heard Mr. Hollis turn his. She named her hand, 2 pair, queens and 9s, before he named his. The room exhaled. Mr. Hollis smiled a half-smile, the way a man smiles at a child who has spoken a kind of first truth. He turned his cards. A flush, hearts down to the 9 of hearts. The flush beat her pair of queens. Adah folded her hands. She did not say a word. She asked him to deal again. He did. For 9 hands, Adah Whitlock lost. The saloon began to fill with the sound of men clearing their throats. They did not want to watch this. The men who had lost to Mr. Hollis for 12 nights. The men who had come to watch a reckoning. The men who had come to be proven right that not even a blind old woman could catch him. They began to feel the slow heat of embarrassment rise in them on her behalf. Eli stood 3 steps behind her, his hands in his pockets, his face white. The 10th hand came. Mr. Hollis, with the courtesy of a man who has beaten a horse, said, "Ma'am, you have been a generous sport. Please let a man buy you a hot meal and call it square." Adah said, in the same calm voice with which she had said everything tonight, "One more hand, sir. Then I will trouble you for the meal." He dealt. Adah, before he had finished pulling the last card off the deck, said, and this was the line that began, 3 days later, to appear on scraps of paper pinned inside saloon doors all the way from here to Denver. "I am an old woman with no eyes, and even I will not pretend to find diamonds where there are none." The room froze. Mr. Hollis's hand, which had been reaching for the pot, did not land. His smile did not fall exactly. It thinned. He turned the top card of his own hand. The Queen of Hearts, which should have been his flush's last card, was wrong. He noticed it then. The Queen of Hearts was squared in his hand, but the flush was not a flush. The 2 cards he had not checked yet, the cards he had hidden in his cuff the way he always hid them, the spare heart, the one he had been slipping onto the bottom of the deck for 11 nights, was no longer in his cuff. It was in Adah's hand. She held it up between 2 fingers for the room to see, the way Walter had once held up a kernel of wheat in the kitchen to show their nephew how a seed unfolded. The room saw a king of hearts in her fingers. The room saw the face of Mr. Hollis go the exact shade of a man who has just realized that the floor he is standing on is no longer there. In that breath, Adah spoke to him in the voice her husband had once called the truest voice in the valley. She said, "I have watched you for 9 hands, Mr. Hollis, the way I have watched this town for 26 years. I do not need to see a card to know its suit. I need only to feel a thumb press the wrong way against it. You have been pressing the same heart twice in every shuffle, every night, every hand. You have been using the same small, careful cheat for what I would guess to be 30 years. And you have been using it against men who were too tired, or too drunk, or too proud to call it." The room exhaled. The widow Granger began to cry. The cavalry lieutenant stepped forward, his hand on his belt, waiting. But Mr. Hollis had not moved. He was staring at Adah with the face of a man who has been seen for the first time by a person who had no business seeing him at all. He whispered to her, the way a man whispers in church, "How did you know I keep the same spare heart in this cuff for 31 years? She answered, slowly, gently, with no pity in it, because pity was not what he had earned. "I have known 4 men whose hands shook only on certain cards. My husband Walter was the first. I learned to hear the breath they take before they cheat. Yours has the rhythm of a man counting the cost of it to himself, every time, and deciding to keep going." Mr. Hollis did not run. He could have. He had a horse saddled at the rail and a pistol in his coat and 30 years of never being caught. He sat very still for a long time, watching the King of Hearts turn slowly between Adah's fingers. Then he stood. He set his pistol on the table, gently, with the care of a man laying down a sleeping child. He walked out into the cold October dark. By morning the stage from Missoula had carried him out of town, and by spring there were posters of him in 3 western towns for the murder of a faro dealer in El Paso. He had not done it here. He would do it later. But the man who had sat across from Adah Whitlock on that Thursday was, in some way, no longer the man who would. Eli brought Adah home that night. He did not speak at first. He walked a half-step ahead, watching the road for her, casting long shadows behind them in the lamplight that spilled from the saloon windows. When they reached her door, he turned and asked, "Why did you wait 9 hands?" Adah answered, almost to herself, "Because I needed every man in the room to be sure he had not been caught fickle. He needed to lose fair in front of all of them who had lost unfair to him. Then he could lose once and mean it. Then he could not come back." Eli stood in the doorway for a moment. He had been a boy who walked into redemption 5 months before with a limp and a letter he would never send, and now he stood in the doorway of a woman who had carried him through a thing that was larger than he was. He said, with the roughness of a young man whose voice had not yet decided what it was, "Adah, what made you walk down there tonight?" She answered, in her smallest voice, the one Walter had once called the voice she kept for the truth she was most afraid of, "I could not bear one more man in this town learning that the night is a place where the dishonest always win." If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. In the days that followed, redemption turned, slowly, the way a face turns toward a fire. The widow Granger came each Tuesday to Adah's parlor and stayed an hour longer than she had any other week. The bartender at the Long Branch began to watch the cards more carefully and to refuse to shuffle for traders he did not trust. The schoolteacher, who had never spoken to Adah before, brought her a plate of honey biscuits one Sunday morning and stayed to listen to the way she listened. And Eli, who had arrived in town as a boy no one had a name for, became the young man who carried Adah's shawl on Sundays and walked her to the parlor of the boarding house with the slow dignity of a person who has been trusted with something he did not yet fully understand. He finished the letter to his dead mother that same autumn, folded it small, and slipped it under a stone in the cemetery on the hill. He did not send it. He had never meant to send it. He had only needed to put it down somewhere it would not be carried by him anymore. One cold morning in the first week of February, the widow Granger came to Adah's door with a proposal. The town, she said, had been collecting for a small fund these past weeks. They had raised, between them, almost $90. They wished to give it to her. She wished, the widow said, that Adah would use it to open her parlor 3 days a week instead of 2, and that she would allow a young woman of the town, a girl named Ruth who had a way with children, to sit beside her on Sundays and learn the way Adah listened. Adah did not answer at once. She was holding in both hands the small gold locket she had not opened in 9 years. Inside the locket was a black and white photograph of Walter Whitlock in his dark coat, looking straight at the camera with the unhurried calm of a man who had lived exactly the life he meant to live. He had died before he could meet the daughter-in-law she had hoped he would meet. He had died before the grandson she had once imagined had learned to ride a bicycle. He had died, and she had kept going. And in keeping going, she had learned the difference between endurance and living. She opened the locket now. She said, "To the widow, I will accept. But please give the largest part of it to the boy, Eli. He has a sister in Butte who has not heard from him in a year, and the road to her is long. Let it buy him a stage ticket home in the spring." The widow cried. The widow cried because Adah had done again what she always did, which was to take the offering and divide it into a thing that looked more like a person than the offering itself. In April, Eli Marsh rode the stage south. He carried in his coat pocket the letter he had written to his sister and, in his other pocket, the small thin envelope Adah had pressed into his hand at the depot. The envelope held 5 $1 bills and a single note written in a hand Walter Whitlock had taught his wife to keep even when her eyes could no longer read it back. The note read, "Bring her home, if she will come. If she will not, bring her answer. Either is worth the trip. M.W." He came back in May. He came back with his sister, who was 19 years old and had a soft, steady voice, and who had not known that anyone in the world remembered her. She had been 3 years old when the fire had killed their mother. She had been raised by an aunt who did not speak of her sister. She had never been written to, until he had arrived at her door in a borrowed coat with his limp and his letter and the readied face of a boy who had decided, somewhere between the cemetery on the hill and the Long Branch Saloon, to be the elder sibling he had not known how to be. They came back to the boarding house. They came back to Adah, who was sitting in her parlor that afternoon with the locket open on her lap. The sister bent and kissed Adah's cheek, and Adah said, simply, "I have known you were coming since October. I could hear the road." 3 days after the sister's arrival, Mr. Hollis's picture appeared on a handbill nailed to the livery barn. It was a photograph the size of a playing card. Underneath, in neat print, was written, "Wanted, in connection with the death of one faro dealer of El Paso, the man calling himself Mr. Hollis, last seen in Redemption, Montana, in October of last year. Reward, $400. By the time the sheriff had walked over to Adah's parlor to ask her a few quiet questions about her memory of that night, the $400 were already sitting on her table, in a neat stack, sent anonymously through the Wells Fargo office, with no return address and no name. Adah did not take the money. She asked the sheriff to split it in even thirds. 1/3 for the widow Granger, 1/3 for the schoolteacher, who had spent her own winter teaching Ruth to sign her name without a tremor. 1/3 for a fund the bartender would administer quietly, to be paid out only when a man walked into the Long Branch and asked for a meal and could not afford one. The bartender asked her that evening, when he brought her the Friday evening meal himself, what he should call the fund. She answered, in the smallest voice she kept for the truest things, in the voice she had used when Walter had died, and when her dog had died, and when her eyes had died, and when the world had almost, but not quite, killed her. Call it the second hand. A man's second chance is the truer hand. So today, in redemption, the bartender pours a glass on the first night of every month in honor of a man no one in town will name. And in the back parlor of the boarding house, every Tuesday and Friday, Adah Whitlock still reads palms. She still listens. She still runs her fingers slow across the cards, alternately, the way Walter taught her in their kitchen with the lamp ticking between them. And the young woman beside her, who has dark hair and a soft, steady voice, is now her apprentice. And the young man whose sister came home in May is now her apprentice too. And they call her, the way the town calls her, not by the name on her door, but by the name the widow Granger has begun to use at last. Not Adah, but the way Walter used to say the name when he came in from the fields. They call her Mama. Next, we'll tell the story of a Comanche translator who was sent away from her own people because of the voice she was born with, and the cavalry captain who heard God in her voice before he ever laid eyes on her.